particular session will be broadly about security and security from a broader understanding, as we have to, according to some theorizations, approach the whole topic of security or the concept from various different perspectives, for example, from the, of course, the military sphere, but also the economic, social sphere, the environmental sphere. And so we will hear about this today. And we will start off with Dr. Whitney Luckenbauer, who has joined us today, and he will tell us more about Arctic security and sovereignty. And with that, you have the floor, Whitney.
Great. Well, thanks, Katerina. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to appear with all of you from my home in Oxford County, which is in Ontario, Canada, on traditional Anishinaabe and neutral territory. It's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. By taking the time to acknowledge the land I stand on, I remind myself of the long history of silencing in this country and the need to speak the truth on a journey towards reconciliation. So I've decided to focus my comments today on something very close to Katerina and my heart, because we worked on a project along similar lines together that yielded a report that I'm happy to share the link to in a couple of minutes on transportation infrastructure. And I'm going to focus my comments on Canada's territorial north, so representing about 40% of Canada's land mass, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, and look at security dimensions, particularly civil military alignments. So 40 slides, 20 minutes, lots of text. If any of you are real keeners, you can follow up with me, and I'm happy to share the deck with you. But want to kind of put this together. And as Katerina described in her opening remarks on the Canada Course Project, it's envisaging Canada's northern transportation system economic flows and connectivity streams in different ways, and not only assessing where they are now, but imagining what they might look like going forward. So this particular slide here gives you sort of a snapshot, high level, of, in essence, the limitations of Canada's northern transportation system in this vast territory. Canada's 3 northern territories, you can almost fit most of continental Europe within this particular area. But obviously a lot, as you see in the left-hand side, right? Drivers of interest, but at the same time, limitations in terms of infrastructure, a limited road network, primarily oriented towards the western part of Canada's Arctic and subarctic within the territories. And obviously, we're going to talk about climate change as a disruptor or a threat multiplier or vulnerability amplifier within this region. So Canada does have an Arctic and Northern policy framework unveiled in 2019 that sets up quite a holistic and broad-based Northern strategy for the country. So I'm just focusing on certain dynamics today, but pretty much strong, self-reliant people and communities working together. Keywords here: vibrant, prosperous, sustainable, at home and abroad, and then expressing Canada's enduring Arctic sovereignty. Canada's framework is very much about putting people at the center and animated by the notion that for Northerners, nothing can be done about the North without Northerners being really key and core to the dimensions going forward. So bringing this up to transportation infrastructure, which I'm going to focus on, there was a common theme raised in all of the public consultations leading up to this policy framework, where people called for transformative investments in infrastructure, complaining about what has typically been a remedial approach that just does sort of enough to keep things in motion, but perpetuates what essentially is described as a state of crisis. So one of the key goals is to strengthen infrastructure to close gaps with other regions of the country. And some of the things are on the right that I'm going to talk to today relate to different modes of transportation infrastructure and how there might be work to integrate or create synergies to inform this whole broader set of goals for the Canadian North, port facilities, airport facilities, roads we're going to touch on here. So that's a national level framework or chapeau for all of this, but it very much mirrors what we see coming out of territorial governments in identifying sustainable investment and development priorities that are emphasizing the need for diversified northern economies and often emphasizing how infrastructure gaps prevent that vibrant economic diversification and activity that they dream of for their peoples, and call for a large-scale investment in northern transportation infrastructure corridors, exactly what Katerina was talking about, including highways, harbors, ports, airports, rail, seeing this as a catalyst for investment in economic opportunities, but also recognizing that Canada's northern Territories, representing in total about 120, 130,000 Canadians, don't have the financial resources to be able to act upon this agenda themselves. A lot of what I'm going to talk about also aligns with what Inuit leaders and First Nations T leaders are calling for in the North, also referring to these infrastructure gaps and also identifying how these explain a lot of the very dismal social, economic, health indicators in the North, particularly indicators that we Halunat or Northern Indigenous people sort of identify as being keys. But tying investments in strategic infrastructure to self-determination, and in essence calling for a massive investment in Inuit Nunangat, so the Inuit homeland in Canada, on the scale of the massive mega projects that really provided a backbone for Canada's development as a whole back in the late 19th century and parts of the mid 20th century. And this is all based upon the need to co-develop and co-implement together. So in Canada's case, we're sometimes dismissive of the amount of consultations or engagement. There's actually been quite a bit of engagement between our federal government and Northern rights holders and stakeholders on these issues, series of roundtables on the future of transportation in the North, asking what should be prioritized, and key trends and drivers having been identified even 6 years ago, right? What unique Northern factors pose particular logistic and commercial challenges? How increasing transportation patterns and investments in transportation infrastructure can positively affect healthier community well-being, can be done in a way that needs to be sensitive to Northern ecosystems, and then also could give rise to safety and security concerns, which we might talk about. More activity means more of a burden for search and rescue. It might also represent vectors for non-friendly interests to get a toehold in the region, but also a common theme that I'm probably not going to refer to enough, but animates a lot of this, is impacts of climate change much more acute in the North and threatening a lot of legacy infrastructure. So existing infrastructure, efficiency, safety, resilience, social and economic development opportunities, never mind creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty as we project into the future and think about what we need to build in going forward. So Canada does have overarching transportation strategies into which the Northern Corridors Initiative specifically would fit. And Canada has committed significant funding towards realizing these initiatives, but so far not promised investments on the scale that's envisaged to really accomplish this transformative Northern landscape. But I want to suggest here that for those of us who are academic right? The answer is not always we need to do original research. There's actually tons of research, well-documented gaps, needs assessments, establishing what is required. I think one of our jobs is to actually bring it together into a coherent framework and figure out what kind of strategic messaging or packaging will help to gain traction and how we leverage these territorial visions that exist as well as those of Indigenous rights holders and figure out alignments between those and national governments, in this case, looking at Canada's. Recognizing that a lot of the justifications for why this is needed have already been articulated, in this case by the government of the Northwest Territories, emphasizing the benefits for humans in the region in terms of social improvements, quality of life, reducing costs of living at a time of dramatic inflation where a lot of things are becoming quite stressed for Canadians to be able to access, facilitating access to resources, right? That's obviously a bit of a double-edged sword in terms of climate change. And we might ask what types of resources, but you can see here, right? Even building in at the territorial government level, that last point, safety, security, defense, and sovereignty is something that's enhanced by infrastructure. Okay, so how is Arctic security changing and how does this come into dialogue? We have Canada's defense policy suggesting that the Arctic region is an important international crossroads where issues of climate change, international trade, and global security meet, and that this is bringing increasing interest in commercial research and tourism activity that will also bring more safety and security demands. Things like search and rescue and natural or humanitarian or human-induced disasters that we need to be able to respond to. Okay, well, to me, that's obvious. Infrastructure, transportation infrastructure will enable those first responders to be able to respond much more effectively. In terms of strategic objectives, we also have much broader goals by Canadian Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces, promising to enhance and expand the defence northern footprint to increase capabilities for surveillance, for domain awareness, to be able to respond in a search and rescue capacity. Promises to preserve and safeguard Canada's Arctic sovereignty, which I'm not going to talk a ton about because I'm never even sure what it always means in these contexts, except to say protecting territorial integrity of Canada from attack. Okay, absolutely. Also to defend North America, develop the right partnerships, and then enhance the ability for our military to project and sustain forces in the area of operations, in this case, the Arctic. So I like the quote that I've provided on the right, in that it suggests it's all about the right balance. And the key words here are dual purpose infrastructure and defense presence. So where can our military, where can our government make smart investments that not only address needs in the defense and national security sphere, but also make sure that the investments are multi-purpose so that they also serve important civilian agendas, deep-seated inequities that exist within the North that are very well documented. And what is the right mix of dedicated defense infrastructure and mix of infrastructure that ideally I would say is even propelled forward by civilian needs or applications, while at the same time serving defense agendas? So we've got some language in our defense policy talking about mobility and reach and footprint, all of which resonate with infrastructure agendas. And we also have a collaboration with the United States on new technologies to improve surveillance and control. It includes renewal of the North Warning System, which I'll get to in just a second. And I always say a lot of those defense of North America are actually best thought of differently than we sometimes bundle together are all Arctic security threats. In this case, we're talking about threats that may pass through the Canadian Arctic to strike at targets outside of the Canadian Arctic, maybe still in Canada or in the United States. But these are a rather different bundling of Arctic security threats than ones that are actually targeting the region itself or are actually existent within the region. But the Arctic still plays a role here. Is preparing the Russians to come invade Alaska or the Canadian? I don't see it like that as such. In fact, not at all. But clearly there's strategic competition going on. And some of the investments that the Russians are making in infrastructure change the whole balance between deterrence and the need for defense. That Canada and its allies need to project that we're capable of defending ourselves in order to prevent or dissuade adversaries from coming and even thinking about attacking us. Sure, that's something we've been doing forever. So what does that mean in terms of requirements for the Canadian Arctic? What Arctic threat are we defending against? How do we think about deterrence in the 2020s? How are we thinking about where the Arctic fits within a world of competition? So my vote is that Arctic exceptionalism is dead. It never really existed. It was something some of us were pushing for in a rather idealistic way. But instead, we're now seeing the Arctic as a competitive space in a world of competition. But that doesn't mean that competition is going on in all domains or at all levels the same way. And when I look at the Arctic, I still ask the question, what are the specific Arctic vulnerabilities that we're identifying that require specific Arctic strategies or postures or investments by our respective Arctic states? So one of the things that Canada said is we will modernize North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, our binational command with the United States, to meet existing challenges and evolving threats. And I want to emphasize to North America, taking into account the full range of threats. So interesting, this is packaged under the Arctic section of our defense policy, but what they're really talking about here is threats to North America. And looking at sensor systems, in this case, dedicated radar systems like our North Warning System, which are used to detect potential incursions into our airspace or aerospace. So this is Cold War legacy infrastructure, primarily a bomber threat flying into North America. The Russians have these on their sides, of course, right? And part of our way of ensuring deterrence was being able to say to would-be adversaries, right, we know you're coming if you send a bomber over, and we'll be able to intercept you. And again, our adversaries doing the same thing. This is a focus of attention because it's nearing the end of its projected life. It's still useful technology, but we're having to figure out, okay, how can the Arctic serve, in essence, defense in depth, strategic defense in depth? How can it give us advanced warning of somebody maybe passing through our Arctic to strike at targets elsewhere? Okay, that makes sense. What the US has really designed, and I'm not going to get into details here, but we can do it in Q&A if you're interested, is really fascinating. It's this system of systems, an ecosystem of domain awareness, language like information dominance, where we ingest a whole bunch of information from sensors in the Arctic and everywhere. Human sensors, this dedicated arrays, radar systems like the North Warning System, but also all the other data that's being scraped by scientists and meteorologists, fusing it together using artificial intelligence, machine learning to process it, and then informing decision makers at the speed of relevance, what this means, and allowing what the US likes to refer to as decision superiority. I mean, there's wonderful acronyms in this space, as defense always has. SHIELD system, it sounds like Marvel, right? Strategic Homeland Integrated Ecosystem for Layered Defense, JEDI, Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure. I mean, the Arctic fits within this, but it's primarily not designed to defend the Arctic. It's the Arctic as a space that will feed into dominance or information dominance as part of overall deterrence missions. So moving on, the next category I'd like to say, so what are the threats then to our Arctic itself? And I'd suggest that, yeah, maybe there are some of these that fall within the defense realm, but most of them are softer security, below the threshold of armed conflict type security threats, right? Of course, there are cyber threats in the Arctic. There are information threats in the Arctic. There's competition going on there as there is elsewhere, right? We've seen, I'd always amplify too, climate change on the meta level, right, definitely is a threat to the Arctic. It's not something that's coming, those greenhouse gas emissions are not primarily coming from the Arctic and affecting the Arctic, they're coming from elsewhere. But then the mitigation of climate change requires global action, so I'm not sure how helpful it is to situate it as a threat to the Arctic that can be addressed primarily through Arctic regional action. But there's this basket of threats here. Here's where we might situate China, for example, and Chinese investment and potentially applying soft power to normalize a presence in the region, right? Some of these narratives around China having a long con or this bait and switch type approach, wanting to get a toehold and then use it for nefarious purposes. I mean, big questions, big debates of which I've intervened, certainly about whether Arctic state sovereignty, sovereign rights, national interests can be balanced with China's interests. Globally, regionally, how are we best situating, conceptualizing China as an Arctic actor? Do we see them as a threat to the Arctic? Is that their primary game? Or is it more broadly us looking at, well, why would it surprise us that China has interest in shipping routes or Arctic resources or Arctic science? I mean, why wouldn't they? They're a global player. What is specific about this that we see as threats and security threats to the North? And then how does this intersect with the potential for China being an investor in transformative infrastructure or economic development in the North? This is played out in Canada with a case study. If any of you are fishing for something to do as a paper, I'm still waiting for a thorough one to be written on the Hope Bay mine. Potential investment by Shandong Gold to take over a Canadian mining operation in a quite strategic place in the middle of the Northwest Passage, Central Canadian Arctic, a deal that was eventually scuttled by the Canadian federal government on the grounds of national security, and fortunately didn't really erupt into a complete political because a Toronto-based mining company stepped in and promised to buy it and continue forward. But really big questions about the desires for encouraging foreign investment in northern mining or in transportation infrastructure if our states, or if, say, Bay Street, the Canadian Wall Street equivalent, right, is not prepared to invest in these. How do we balance off the potential for China to be a source or other non-like-minded state sources to provide this with security risks alongside? Real tricky questions. Finally, threats in the Arctic. I'd suggest most of these relate to environmental stressors and humanitarian challenges. So in essence, these are often bundled together with these other Arctic security threats. I'd say if we think about our sectors of security, right, these are much more human security, societal security, economic security, environmental security. These are very real. They are very present. They're social and economic inequities that most Northern stakeholders have suggested can be addressed through infrastructure investments. It's climate change, obviously creating great stressors and even undermining some of the very difficult sales pitches we already face if we're trying to encourage private sector investment or private-public partnerships in the Canadian Arctic. We have a road network that's vulnerable in the north because we have permafrost degradation, which is challenging horizontal grades, sort of if we think of flat infrastructure, right? And we can see this playing it out in other parts of the north. Certainly, we see challenges relating to the loss of ice roads, which are really key as a way to communities on ice roads. You know, during the wintertime, incredibly vulnerable to climate change, obviously, but also affect the cost benefit calculations for mining sites if this is something that we can no longer reliably think we can turn to. We have incredible system deficits in terms of air transportation. Short runways, largely gravel in the north, very limited in terms of the size of airframe that can actually land there, and therefore limitations on opportunities to not only deal with safety and security incidents, but also manage resupply if you face a crisis in these communities. And then in terms of marine transportation, right, a strong deficit of marine facilities that hinder efficiency and capacity of sea lift, so resupply of communities, bringing goods into the communities, but also obviously affecting the ability of the Canadian Navy or the Canadian Coast Guard or other agencies to work within the region to deal in the security sphere. So the big question then in a lot of Canadian circles is, there's a commitment to increase Canada's military presence, but where then do we increase the military footprint? And how does this align with threats through to and in the Canadian Arctic? It's sensors, it's all domain awareness, stuff that the Northern Corridor Project talks about in terms of connectivity. How can we tether some of those benefits for private sector and community interests with the need for investments in redundant systems, satellite broadband, a mix of several different systems, right, for system integrity in a way that aligns defense, security, and civilian benefits? How do we think then about Northern Canadian aviation and where investments are made to lengthen runways and harden runways and improve airstrips so that there can be benefits, not only in terms of military projection and response capability, but also benefits to communities? And in terms of the maritime Arctic, how are we situating threats? We Canadians love to get our knickers in a knot about hypothetical threats to our sovereignty and Northwest Passage and status of waters. But if we're thinking about threats in the Arctic, and if we're thinking about advancing diversified economic opportunities for Northerners, perhaps we should be scaling this down and thinking about a lot of the east-west connections within our Arctic, not just the north-south ones, that will help to enable more trade between communities and supports between communities, but also allow communities to support one another if they face a security challenge. So to me, it all fits with corridors if we're thinking about them as enabling flows. So what kind of port and harbor infrastructure do we need? And perhaps some of these solutions might be more localized than the way we've typically conceived of big national north-south linking investment. And then I want to get really creative and fun, right, to look ahead and begin to anticipate future modes of transportation and infrastructure needs for things that are just coming online, or for new innovative solutions to transportation that maybe haven't yet been realized. What kind of infrastructure might we envisage for lighter than air vehicles, right? How do we perhaps bring the North into Amazon's global reach of using drones to go and deliver goods to houses? How can that help to enable different forms of healthcare delivery, for example? So how do we also think about infrastructure investments in the North that are anticipating a changing environment at the same time as we find all these stressors to existing infrastructure?
Thank you, Whitney, and have a good meeting at the Parliament. So now we will actually talk a bit more about climate change with Dr. Nathan DiBertoli.
So my name is Nathan DiBertoli, and I'm a climate change scientist and consultant. I worked previously in Canada for the Arctic regions. I did some risk assessment for the Canadian Arctic, looking at airports and ports infrastructure. And now I'm working as a consultant and a Planet Adapt collaborative hub in Germany. And the study that we developed here is an analysis for the University of Calgary, the School of Public Policy, and we aim to estimate the climate change future costs of infrastructure in the proposed Canadian Northern Corridor. Dr. Pierce and Dr. Ford guided me through the development of this product, And this is a pilot research, and I'll be presenting just a section of the research that we are currently developing. So the main research question that we had for this project was to understand how climate change and extreme weather may create choke points in infrastructure for the Canadian Northern Corridor, and how much these choke points would increase in terms of costs for the current infrastructure that exists there and infrastructure that will be built in the future. So to develop this scientific approach, we looked at some studies that have been done in the past for Russia, Canada, and the US, where other scientists have tried to understand how climate change and climate stressors were affecting different types of infrastructure. Most of the studies did not look at infrastructures in general, but they tried to focus on just one type of infrastructure. In the case of our study, we would be looking at three major infrastructures in Northern Canada, including transportation, energy, telecommunications, and buildings. And the data that we collected from these inventories in Canada are from the Canadian National Inventory, where we consider 9 of the segments that they have available within the 3 main sectors of infrastructures. So the first pillar in this research was to collect, process, and analyze the available inventory data for these 3 sectors of infrastructures that we're looking at, and also the climate scenarios and how climate change is affecting the area. The second step would be to create a response to understand how is this choke points occurring, creating response functions so that we can connect the stressor of the climate change to the type of infrastructure. And the third pillar would be to calculate this climate stress response functions for 3 sectors, including 3 different scenarios. So we would be considering a business as usual scenario where there is no governance and considering climate change impacts, a reactive response where governments would wait until the problem happens to react, and a proactive response where you have governance being created before or considering climate scenarios before a hazard could happen in the region. And finally, what we intend to do in this research is to integrate all these different costs into a final cost calculation. I have to warn you that because of data gaps, we're not able to calculate the delay costs, which is something that I'll explain a little bit further in the presentation. So we are just going to present the repair costs for all these different infrastructures, considering the business as usual scenario, so the highest emission scenario in the future. And then I will show you how these different costs are occurring in the different regions in Canada. So to actually have, to assess these different climate variables that we used, we consider a 200-kilometer buffer zone within this proposed area for the corridor. We included climate variables from the IPCC report, the number 5, and also the climate projections for the latest one, number 6. We considered the model ensemble for these different climate reports, and each one of these climate ensembles, they have a different number of models that project these different climate variables. So within these climate variables, we were able to identify some hazards, hotspots. Hazard hotspots, I mean regions where some of these climate variables are showing that the impact of them will be higher or lower depending on the area of the corridor. So we looked at permafrost, we looked at freezing rain, snowfall, wildfires, sea ice concentration and thickness, how droughts are going to be occurring in the region, and also we consider surface winds and extreme precipitation. And at the end, in this climate change compartment of our analysis, we integrated all these different variables into a final choke point accumulation of hazards so that we could detect those hotspot areas that are considering all these different hazards for the corridor. This is just an image so that you have an idea of some of the variables that we looked at. We just considered them for this area of the corridor. And from the projections that we have considering this business as usual scenario with the highest emissions, we see that for the sea ice concentration, thickness, minimum and mean temperatures, drought, snow depth, and extreme precipitation is the variables that are going to impact the most this area of the corridor. Here is just some of the data that we collected from these different projections, just showing you that it's amazing like how much sea ice thickness is decreasing in the region. The temperatures have a huge change in terms of the highest emission scenario. You see a change of 9 to 10 degrees in some regions of the corridor, especially more in the north. And snowfall in general will decrease a lot, and we see an increase in extreme precipitation for most of the areas. So what is this choke point analysis I was mentioning and I was talking about? So we are considering these different hotspots. So we are trying to see through the averages of these different climate variables where we could see hotspots for this specific extremes in climate. So you can see through here that most of the snow increase would be in the eastern parts of the corridor. The extreme increases in precipitation would be mostly in the northern areas of the Northwest, but also in the extreme areas of New Labrador. And although we will see impacts on the prairies, they are not as extreme as the other regions in red. We see an increase in freezing precipitation, especially throughout the prairies. So as the weather becomes more warm, instead of seeing snow in these regions, we'll see more the transition between rainfall and snow in the northern parts of the corridor. And we know that this type of precipitation causes a lot of problems for telecommunications and other types of infrastructures. Wildfires will also increase much more in the north, especially for the prairies. And the snow cover duration will decrease a lot in these more central areas of the corridor. So in general, we see that the central areas of the corridor, considering the prairies and the Northwest, will be the regions that will be mostly impacted. So when we normalize all these different variables and all this different information together on the extreme events, we come to this choke points where we consider the lowest impact 0 and the highest impact 1. So when we put all these different hazards together and we normalize them, we see that Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and the Northwestern Territories and British Columbia will be the areas that will be mostly affected. So if you look at the map in red, the red parts, you see that those are the parts of the corridor that will be accumulating all these different hazards. So with that, we finalize the climate change information. And then we move to the second part of analysis where we collected all this different infrastructure data for all these different provinces in Canada. And then we did a cluster analysis to identify all the buildings in these different regions and how close or far apart these different buildings are. The data that was collected for the inventory for all these different infrastructures started in 2018. We did have some issues because at the beginning of the project, we wanted to look at the infrastructures more at the municipality level, but then data was not available and we had to go at a higher level and look more at the provinces so that we could analyze the final data through the province information. So the cluster of the infrastructures, the clusters that are more important are found in Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories. And the low clustering of these infrastructures are found in Alberta, Manitoba, Western Ontario, and Eastern Quebec. In the previous presentation, they wanted to show you the amount of people living in some of these areas. So I brought a map here. In the corridor area, we have almost 800,000 people living, and this data is from the census from 2016. So maybe now we have more people inhabiting this area of the corridor. So in terms of infrastructure investment that has been done since 2020, we see that the infrastructure types that have been higher investment It was in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwestern Territories and Manitoba. And the areas that received more investment in infrastructure was transportation engineering, electric power infrastructure, and institutional building sectors. The areas that have the oldest infrastructure is the Northwestern Territories, Alberta, Manitoba, and British Columbia. And the infrastructures that are the oldest are marine engineering infrastructure, institutional buildings, electric power infrastructure. And the infrastructures that are the newest are located in Manitoba, Alberta, and Northwestern Territories and British Columbia. And the newest infrastructure is related to electric power infrastructure, transportation, engineering, and institutional buildings. So you're going to ask me, Nathan, it's becoming very confusing, your explanation. First, you showed us the climate data, and second, you showed us the inventory for this different infrastructure for these regions of Canada. So how did you put this together? So what we did is that we created a matrix to relate the extreme hazards that were more connected to different types of infrastructures, considering the reality of the Nordic or Arctic regions. So to combine these things together, we used a formula that has been used in similar studies in the past. It's a formula by a study by Larsens in 2018. We had to readapt the formula because there was data gaps for some of the costs used in the formula. But briefly, what the formula does is that it calculates infrastructure costs, it calculates considering the changing infrastructure life cycle replacement costs from the present period to the future. And the baseline annual cost of replacing infrastructure was calculated by dividing each infrastructure type cost per unit by each infrastructure type design useful lifespan. So the adjusted annual cost was calculated using the formula, but with each infrastructure useful life adjusted for climate change. And on top of that, we had to apply a discount rate of 3%, which is very common in the literature, so that we can update the values for the current value that we have now today in the Canadian context. And why it's used, this discount rate. The discount rate it's used to make a determination of the future cash flow from a project or investment, and how much this project or investment will be worth in terms of capital outlay needed to fund the projects or investments in the present. So in terms of the results of the combination of the climate extremes and the inventory that we use to check how much this infrastructures would be impacted by climate change in Canada, we found this different values. So on the first table here on the right, we have the inventory values, including the discount rate of 3%. On the second table on the bottom, you have the inventory containing the choke point information. So here you see that for the first infrastructure type on this sector of transportation, the current baseline value was $1 billion, including all the provinces together. But when you add the information from the climate streams, that jumps to a $3 billion cost in terms of infrastructure value. So we do see how much more climate change can impact these infrastructures in terms of costs in the future for this specific area of the corridor. Some of the information that we analyzed, such as permafrost, freezing rain, and fires, this data doesn't have projections in the future, so we had to use a static baseline. So we just projected the costs, thinking of the values of today, including these different extremes. So we see that permafrost will be one of the highest impacts in terms of infrastructure in British Columbia, Alberta, and Manitoba, reaching almost 10 billion. Freezing rain will also be a problem, especially for Alberta, almost reaching 4.5 billion. And fires will be a problem in BC and Alberta, with values between 3 to 6 billion increase in terms of investment for investment costs for this type of infrastructure related to this three static hazards. When we think of the different climate variables, we see that if we consider all the different provinces together, the variable that will affect the most is rainfall, extreme rainfall that falls within 5 days. So if we think of episodes of extreme weather, as we're looking at landslides that happen in BC, we also see a lot of flooding happening in the prairies provinces in the last few years. So the more you have consecutive rain for more than 5 days, you will see more and more these disasters happening in the future, creating more costs for infrastructure. The costs could rise to 19 billion just considering this extreme rainfall in 5 days. The second cost that we see the highest is surface winds that will be affecting a lot of the telecommunications networks and other important energy infrastructures. And the third one is also related to precipitation, and then we go with temperature and other things. And this is considering the cumulative process for all these different provinces. When we look specifically for the provinces, we see that this consecutive rain in 5 days will affect mostly the province of Manitoba, with almost 9 billion increase in costs. Surface winds will impact mostly BC, almost 5 billion costs. So we think of the ports, how ports in the coastal areas will be dealing with the infrastructure for high winds when ships are rising. So this is it's just a very general overall analysis, because there's so many other details that will show at the end of the presentation that will need to be considered in further calculations. We just wanted to give an overall view of the costs at their high level in the different provinces with the different climate choke points. And this is an idea, another vision, where we look at the increase of these costs. So we see almost 300% increase in costs due to climate change in the future for the different types of infrastructure in Manitoba and Alberta, especially. And we see that the highest costs are related to rainfall and precipitation in the areas of the corridor for these provinces. So just to wrap up and show you the main findings that we saw that infrastructure costs will increase in all selected variables and sectors, with differences among the regions and the infrastructure types. The accumulated choke points are more concerning for Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, and the Northwestern Territories. We did not include Saskatchewan results in the analysis because the population in these areas of the Northern Corridor is not significant in terms of the other provinces that we're looking at. So we decided not to include Saskatchewan this time in the analysis. So the increase in infrastructure investment would be more than 102% compared to the data of today if we look at the high emission scenario. And the total cost for the provinces and the 9 infrastructure types that we consider could reach more than 12 billion, depending on these infrastructure types. And the costs could reach at the end of the century almost 65 billion, according to the latest IPCC scenario, and 51 billion considering the older report that we also included in the analysis. The sectors mostly impacted would be transportation engineering, electric power infrastructure, institutional buildings, and oil and gas. And the provinces that we looked that are more impacted in the corridor area is Manitoba, Alberta, and British Columbia. So here, I'm gonna show you a lot of the gaps that we found in the data sets. Infrastructure inventory, as I said, was not available for a lot of the municipalities. As I said, we wanted to do some case studies for the municipalities, but we couldn't do that because this inventory was not available for all the municipalities. Of course, climate projections have a lot of uncertainties. We did not find climate projections that we could use for permafrost and freezing rain. There's a lot of lack of information on the lake costs for the corridor area. The lake costs are highly punctual and may never be available for the corridor regions. And it's very difficult to find specific values in the life cycle of infrastructure types related to the energy sector, especially for the transmission lines and poles. So we try to look for specific values and inventory for the transmission lines and poles and the values that are charged and we couldn't find this easily in any data set or inventory. And the limitations that we find is that this is the first case study, a first pilot. It's a very high level analysis, so we have to look at these values very carefully. The resolution of the climate models is not the best. And I'm gonna pass and show you, I've been talking about the delayed costs, and now I'm finally gonna tell you what are the delayed costs. So the next part of our study, we would like to consider more this specific costs on delay. So how these people that live in the corridor are gonna be affected by different extremes that will affect their daily lives. So how is the cost of track buckling events? How is temperature and precipitation increase on renting roads affecting these citizens? What about the timber pole degradation, the lost life of distribution transformers, building infrastructure, removal of damaged equipment or vehicles, the lost freight to bring one thing to another, and because of congestion or extreme event, trucks cannot move, ships cannot move, or intense snowfall, planes are not able to land at the airport because the airport doesn't have the correct radar. And finally, how much will cost to bring assistance and rescue for these very remote areas of the corridor? How much is the death value of a person that loses the death in that region, the inability to go to work? How are companies in the region going to face costs in terms of absenteeism, the loss of productivity, loss of hours, day, and work? Or what about the health and medical costs in those remote areas? Do we have the infrastructure for that, or we don't? How are we going to think the development of these infrastructures in these areas if we see that the common infrastructures that we have will have a huge increase in prices in the future? Is the best way of doing things in the future doing the same type of infrastructures that we're doing today? And also these people that are going to suffer with accidents depending on the type of extreme weather that we have, landslides and other problems. What about the rehabilitation and physiotherapy of these people? So there is all this stress response equations that have to be created in terms of the delay and the repair, that unfortunately we still do not have all the data gaps needed to finalize this type of analysis, but we're moving on and trying to find answers to that. I will finish my presentation here. Thank you so much. I really apologize for my English, but I try to be as fast as I could. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Nathan. And I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Stephen Vamosi for his presentation.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Little bit newer to working in the North, but absolutely hooked by what I've done so far. I also just want to say I'm on Treaty 7 lands, and rather than a standard acknowledgement, I just want to say that I am very keenly aware that those treaties were set up never for the benefit of the original inhabitants or their relations, and always for people like me. So keeping that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about biodiversity implications of infrastructure development in the North, following nicely on the last two talks, I think. And a big shout out to the previous presenter, because I looked at that paper quite a bit, especially as I was starting. And I think I have some points that are sort of follow on or are relevant to what Nathan talked about. So excellent presentation, good setup for me for sure. Oh, should start that. Oh, I'm having trouble with that. There we go. So first of all, just some acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the awesome postdoc of mine, Christy Sampson, who I went to the Yukon with in the fall, 17-day driving trip. It was amazing. And formed some of the things that I then subsequently wrote about. Great RAs in Emily and Afra, and also thank you so much. The invitation from the U of C School of Public Policy and some financial support from the usual characters. So first thing I want to start off, and I think most people know this on the call, but what's really sort of overriding in my research and what I think about a lot, and I think is really relevant here, is that we are in the middle of a global biodiversity crisis. There are several crises, grand challenges, whatever you call them. But I think, to me, I think this is the biggest one, or shared equally with climate change. And of course, those two do not act independently. They very much support and feed into each other. There's a lot of stats I could throw at you. I've just put up a few here, but basically, I'm not aware of a major plant or animal group that's not threatened. Not aware of groups that haven't already lost species in the last several centuries. You know, contrary to what you read on social media, this is human-driven. It's pretty conclusively demonstrated time and again that this is humans. And then some of the groups, like one of the ones I study in my lab, are really threatened. So over 40% of amphibian species, for example, are threatened worldwide, and that includes the long-toed salamander, as I say, that we study here. So there's that backdrop. This is real. And so sort of anything I study, anything I think about is always against this backdrop of human activities almost always negatively impact the natural heritage of this planet. And what are some of the threats? Well, these are the major threats, and they're already present in Northern Canada. We have, I think, at least in the South, we like to kind of portray Canada as relatively doing okay. We like to pretend that we're going to be fine as climate change happens, because yeah, possibly we're not going to be the ones hitting the 40s, but there's going to be lots of effects as we both erode biodiversity, and also the planet continues to change and warm up. One of the big ones is habitat loss. That's sort of three interrelated things. So one is just straight loss. So imagine there's a forest, you cut it down and you replace it with, I don't know, the town of Canmore. Sorry, I just came from there yesterday. So that, for example, is mostly loss. The second one is that you still have a pond, for example, but due to mining or other activities upstream, you now have pollutants in there. And so you do an overflight and you're like, oh, there's still a pond, but now you've dramatically altered the conditions in that pond. The last one is fragmentation. So that's fairly simple concept, but with many, many effects. You have an intact forest, for example, and then you go through and you make a road. There's one example, or you cut some, and now you have patches that are less suitable for living in. They are now drier, hotter, easier to be preyed upon, etc. So they present a lot of challenges for organisms. Climate change, I won't talk about very much. We just had a great talk about that. But one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, especially in these northern environments with a lot of mountains. So the picture in the background is from the Yukon, just off the Dempster. So good to see the Dempster was mentioned earlier. As temperatures rise, we have cold adapted species that are basically marching up mountains as they're being forced away from lower elevations, and eventually there's nowhere to go up top, and so you lose species that were cold acclimated. And that's just one example of climate change effects. Over harvesting, we've driven so many species to extinction or near extinction. Locally, again, post colonialism, we almost lost beavers and bison from the entire continent, and it's been an interesting road back for those species. Pollution's a big one. Again, a lot of our activities produce various byproducts, and even things like roads, we salt them, we put dirt on them, they're noisy, there's light. These are all things that are bad for various species. And the last one, I don't know what it is about my people, but we have an obsession with bringing species from one place to another. Europeans, Brits, etc. were really big on this back in the day. And so you had species that were removed from their native habitat, released from their native predators, competitors, parasites, and then put in here. Now you have species that are naive to these, and there's been some devastating effects of those. So really quickly, because it's been talked about, but again, what is the Canadian Northern Corridor? It's this multimodal right of way, could be up to 7,000 kilometers in length. Of course, it's there to connect us from sea to sea to sea, and again, is there to fill gaps in our transportation corridor. And the one main thing I just want to say is that, again, this is all notional, it's not in place. But as a biologist, as an ecologist, when I see a corridor, it's important or realize that I have the perspective that those effects always go beyond those buffers. And so it's never just the effect of the road. As soon as you're on the other side of the road, the effects are over. We have effects that then tend to pervade into local habitats, and they do a lot of other things. So, but anyways, there's the CNC, the paper, the manuscript that I've written, sort of answered a few questions around what might be the opportunities around the CNC for biodiversity, and also what are the challenges. And unsurprisingly, I'm happy I got invited today because I'll talk a lot about the challenges, and unfortunately I see relatively few opportunities at this point. in terms of bettering biodiversity in the north. So going back to those threats then, what do I see might happen if you put in a multimodal corridor or any massive development in the north? And again, I don't want to just pick on the one thing, but if we go in and start to make more roads, more transmission lines, more pipelines, what are we possibly looking at? So first picture, we're looking at, it's actually not from here, but we're looking at a road going through a forest. So again, you immediately lose some habitat. That's clear. Less clear, you degrade that habitat and the habitat around it. And certainly, again, you do this fragmentation. So now you have individuals and species that beforehand were moving back and forth, from left to right, up and down through this picture. And now you have this road. And so either you have organisms that are going to risk crossing, and more, direct mortality for roads and railways and other things is massive. It's a huge thing. Entire review papers and hundreds of papers have been written about road hazards. One of many things that I can't talk about in depth, but there's that. But also you'll have individuals that will choose not to move or will take their time moving. And so now you start to see effects on gene flow and the genetic integrity of species because they tend not to move across it. And that actually affects bats and birds too. It's not just terrestrial organisms, which is interesting. Now, once you put in a road or other things, then over-harvesting, poaching, illegal or unregulated hunting all rise. And so there's this picture of trees from old growth forests that are being cut down on Vancouver Island because people have access to them. And again, as the economy is not great, people are looking for other ways to either not buy things or to try to sell them illegally. So I have massive concerns about what would happen if you start to, put in a network of roads. Pollution. So this is a picture, some pictures I took from the Yukon. Everywhere I went, and we were sampling creeks on the side of roads. Everywhere I went, signs of human activity. So pop cans and bullet casings and everything. We're looking right now at microplastic loads in streams, and my collaborators, they're off the charts. I can't believe how bad it is. We also do things like collect and display rotting cars, which is an interesting phenomenon for me. So many waterways I saw in panel C, just highly modified and do not look healthy. And then D is an example of something, a road's gone through, and I'm not quite sure what the intent is here, but it looks like a big scar on the landscape, and it's going to take a long time, if ever, for that to look anything like it did before that. Also, again, climate change, I will say, I think we have to be mindful of the increase as we transport more resources, as we extract more resources along the way, we are directly contributing to climate change. And so I understand, and I'm sensitive to the arguments that we need these corridors and we need to provide more resources, but again, they do come at a cost, and those have to factor into the calculations, whatever those are. And then the last one is, again, these aren't the only ones, but another major one is we think about opening up ports and now connecting the east to the north to the west more easily. Relatively speaking, the Canadian North has been free from the effects or relatively dampened effects of invasive species. That's not going to hold if we suddenly are able to get really quickly from Newfoundland up to top of the Northwest Territories and back down to BC. We are going to increase the rate at which we throw down those propagules, and some of them will be successful, and that may have devastating impacts on already sensitive ecosystems. So those are some of the sort of general major concerns. That keeps happening. There we go. So one of the things that the proponents of the CNC will work with, and we'll have to guide them as well. So I never knew quite how to pitch this, but there are at least 3 really relevant federal acts that I think are going to be at play as the CNC is, further discussed and developed. The first one is the Canadian Wildlife Act back from 1985. That's really dictates the creation, management, and protection of wildlife areas for wildlife research activities, and also for the conservation or interpretation of wildlife. This works in parallel with the Species at Risk Act, so SARA, which is from 2002, which is pretty simple, fairly straightforward, at least in intent. That is to prevent the loss of wildlife species in Canada, guide the recovery of species that are either locally extinct, so extirpated, or at risk of extirpation. And it also is meant to manage species of concern before their status worsens. Another thing I could have written an entire paper on, and others have, CIRA is fantastic in principle and has a lot of shortcomings in practice, especially in terms of the willingness of politicians to act on the or mandate the recommendations that come out of the working groups from CIRA and COSAWIC. That's the body that's associated with it. As far as protected areas and the CNC directly, luckily, I didn't notice that many that might overlap, but the relatively newly erected Edesi Indigenous protected area that was set up in partnership between the Decho First Nations and the Government of Canada in 2018, that's going to be one to watch. It's very large at 14,000 square kilometers. It's noted for its ecological, cultural, and spiritual significance. And again, knowing what I know, what I talk about in terms of these effects that go well beyond where the highway actually is or where the pipeline actually is, this is something I expect CNC proponents are going to have to want to work very carefully with the relevant partners here to make sure that this is well skirted, and if it does go nearby, that provisions are in place to minimize its impact. And then the last one is quite new, and it's a little bit early to say how well it's going to, or how effective it's going to be, but the Impact Assessment Act from 2019, introduced by the Liberals, who do occasionally do some good things. It was meant to strengthen and bolster the older one from 2012. We all know how much Harper gutted everything, all the environmental protections and science in the country. And so again, in principle, so it's a federal process for impact assessments and the prevention of significant adverse environmental effects. As I say, quite new, especially with the pandemic. I think it's a bit early to say how that's going to play out, but I like that it's there in place. And my recommendation in the paper in here is that, the CNC proponents look to that and look to ways to not just barely meet it, but to like smash through and exceed the requirements of something that comes out of an IAA assessment. So those are some of the high level things. I did want to talk about sort of a few more specific things that I think are relevant. So one of them is I think there's going to be special consideration for particular focal species. And again, as a biologist, I don't always study the big charismatic megafauna, as people like to call it. And so, it hurts me a little bit to talk about caribou, but not really. But for example, so we have the boreal caribou, or the woodland caribou boreal population as it's referred to. And if you recall the map that I showed earlier, and for those of you who know the CNC, you'll recognize that a lot of the proposed CNC overlaps with the current range of the boreal caribou. Boreal caribou are culturally and economically important for Indigenous peoples throughout the range. And so, that's already a consideration. We have a road and other things that are going to go through it. Moreover, when you look at some of the identified threats, there's even more cause for concern or pause for concern. So, for example, one of their threats is increased predation by species in areas that have been affected by anthropogenic activities. That includes forestry, roads, and other linear features. Right? They do pretty well evading predators in intact habitats, less so when something can just sort of gun them down or run them down on a road. There's concern about illegal and unregulated hunting. And there's also concern about noise and light disturbance, vehicle collisions, and pollution. The other interesting thing about boreal caribou is that they're considered an umbrella species. And so there's this thinking out there that if you do something that's good for caribou, you're probably going to do right by a bunch of species that we tend not to study. So humans are very good at finding certain species interesting and others not. But if we do things that protect this particular species, we may in fact be reaping a lot of benefits of other understory species, for example, other plants and things like that. So, but there's no way that you go ahead with the CNC without a lot of talk and a lot of consideration of boreal caribou. I'm just going to guarantee that right now. The other interesting thing about all this, and of course, it has to be the case, but right now, if you look at what I'm calling Northern Canada, it's relatively, not exclusive, but it's relatively roadless, there are patches of, relatively large patches of intact forests. So of course, that's why you might propose a CNC, and I get that, that's fine. But there's a few things to think about specifically with that topic. So the first one is that obvious road hazards. Right now, where there aren't roads, you're not worried about hitting things on roads because there aren't roads. Where you have intact forest and you don't have a road, you're not worried about curtailing the movements of animals and even the spread of plants, etc. So that's immediate one concern. But the second one is sort of a bigger one to me, and that is that there's this global imperative to maintain roadless areas. Roadless areas have numerous, maybe even countless benefits for biodiversity and ecosystems in general. And Paul et al. Just this year published this great paper, and this is one of their figures. This is one of their reconstructions of the map or the road density currently in Canada. And it turns out to be really hard to actually say this with accuracy. But one of their conclusions is, quote, Canada has a global responsibility for effective stewardship and maintenance of road-free areas within the context of biodiversity protection and climate change commitments. So again, we can think about what Canada might need. And again, I really appreciate that comment about Northern Canada, what the citizens of the land or the members, those people in the lands there need and want. But there is a global arena to play with here too. And so we really need to think about that, because Canada is a global reservoir for boreal forests, peatlands, and wetlands. And in the paper, I have overlaid maps of the wetlands. I don't talk about that much about peatlands, but again, development is going to affect that. And one of the things they also talk about are tendrils. And you see there's these real density, real hotspots for roads, and you see these little tendrils going up. And they're already extending without a major highway or other thing to connect to. And imagine you overlay that new corridor. Now people are going to be really motivated to connect those things up. And so now you will further break up the land compared to what you would see, because I think that's just going to act as a magnet for these little tendrils to grow. So again, global considerations here for what we do next in these lands. Sorry, running out of time here. So I'll just say there's this other interesting concept, and I've already kind of alluded to it before, but Johnson et al. In 2020 published this great paper on growth-inducing infrastructure. Really this concept that is when, and I quote the misattributed quote from Field of Dreams, build it and he will come. It really does work that way. So you get permission to put in an electric transmission line. All the assessments are done on that. But the problem is that over time, mines and forestry and OHVs and more trapping and things happen. So again, I think there's a moral imperative that if you're putting something in, that you think about what else might follow on that. And who's responsible for that? And how do you manage that? And so really nice figure from that paper. That's an excellent paper to discuss at length. But again, this concept that we're not just going to put in the 1 to 10 kilometer infrastructure corridor and done. Other things will follow. And I know from some perspectives that's good. We just have to be really mindful of it. And especially those that are harder to monitor, right? The legal stuff is hard to monitor, hard to predict, but it's going to be there. And we can't turn a blind eye to that. So opportunities, I see two. And very seriously, one of them I think is that the CNC could be the gold standard for large infrastructure development projects similar to it throughout the world for a long time to come. If the corridor is put in properly, and at the same time, with reference to evidence, we put in wildlife crossings, we fence it properly, we are mindful of the balance between minimizing mortality with breaking up populations, this could be the project that, throughout the world, you got to look at the CNC, you're thinking about building this big road through this area. I really believe that. Now, from a Western science perspective, the other opportunity, so this is a recent report put out about the state of watersheds in Canada. Overall, it's not good news. All I want you to look at on the panel on the right here is the areas in gray. The data deficient watersheds are almost exclusively from the north. And so again, from a Western science perspective, if you put in roads and other infrastructure, I know how hard it is to do field work in the north. And so we would have more eyes on it. Of course, you could also just ask have rural communities, Indigenous people living in the area, and they can probably tell you as well. But again, Western science perspective, this is probably going to be a boon for us. Last point, most important point. So don't read into it being the last slide. It's more like I want to end on this note. Anything we do has to be done in real partnership with Indigenous people. We have to give equal priority, equal importance, equal respect to Indigenous knowledge systems. I recommend following the Clayoquot Sound model, where there was an oversight panel that had very strong representation of relevant elders and knowledge keepers, together with, of course, the usual cast of Western scientists, policymakers, social scientists, etc. Given the scope of the project, I'm going to suggest multiple such oversight panels, because again, we need to avoid pan-Indigenous approaches. What's going to work in Newfoundland, or what we currently call Newfoundland, is not going to work in Northwest Territories. And furthermore, for that, one community to another in the Northwest Territories may have very different needs. And this is my lovely friend Tessa Bailey up in the Yukon. We're at fish camp where we should have been overrun with Chinook salmon. And instead, because of overfishing and climate change, that community has decided to put in a moratorium on harvesting, with lots of negative effects on their community and their youth and their elders. So yeah, there's lots to think about there. But again, no single kilometer should go in unless there is buy-in and support from a local community. I think that has to be the first thing and has to be present throughout. All right, thank you so much. I'll end on a very dry slide, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vamosi. That was really fantastic. And thank you so much for ending on this note on Indigenous knowledge system, because now the next session, which is led by Dr. Jen Sidorova, is actually especially on Indigenous knowledge and integrating Indigenous knowledge into the Canadian Northern Corridor. So please stay on if you want to hear more about that. But